Hey guys, how's it going? So, this is the first lesson video I've ever really done on here, so bear with me. I'm going to try and be as concise as possible without rambling too much. So, what I want to share today is basically this little formula that I came up with that will enable you to pretty much automatically generate some nice sounding bebop lines over whatever chord progression you might be working with, okay? And the reason why I think it's helpful is because a lot of people, they understand scales, chords, arpeggios, and harmony and theory and all that, and they have a basic understanding of how to approach improvising or creating lines over a set of changes, but it's just that the lines that they're coming up with, there's just something about them where they don't really have that flow to them, or they're not really reminiscent of that bebop sort of sound or language. So this is just a suggestion, a good thing that you could use, where if you do use this formula, you will pretty much, the end result that you will get will be good sounding lines that should give you what you're looking for, all right? And basically what it will enable you to do is this. In a real life playing scenario, you wouldn't necessarily want to play straight eighth notes all the way through an entire course of a progression, but to have the ability to do that, to play straight eighth notes all the way through the progression and have the chord changes be perfectly outlined and have a nice flow to them and really just sound nice and like bebop. So have the ability to do that will be of tremendous benefit to you. So basically that's what this formula is you're just going to be playing straight eighth notes through whatever chord changes you want, and basically it's specifically like what notes do you play at certain positions, and if you just plug them into this formula, the end result should give you what you're looking for, all right? So I think that the first thing to understand is how do we define a basic unit of this formula, okay? Because the way it's basically working is you're basically taking this single unit and just perpetuating it over and over again through a set of changes. So where the first unit ends, after that the next one begins and the formula starts over again, and you just keep cycling through it, okay? So we have to sort of define what one unit is. And in bebop, typically you can define it as a lot of fast moving chord changes where you don't really usually stay on one chord for that long. Sometimes you might stay on one chord for maybe 2 measures at a time. I know there's exceptions, it could be longer, but usually not even that long. Usually the chords are either 1 measure long, or you might have 2 chords per measure, meaning a half measure long. So for the simplest unit of this formula and what we're going to be working with, we're going to be talking about chords that are a half measure long for now. And since we're talking about eighth notes, that means that we have 4 eighth notes per chord, or 4 notes. So essentially, for one unit of the formula, it's basically what do you play at each one of those 4 notes, all right? Now, before we get into it, let me just also say that this is just a guideline, it's just a starting off point, it's just one approach. All the rules that I'm presenting here can certainly be broken. There's exceptions to all of them. And ultimately, the best tool in your arsenal when you're creating music or lines is your ear. And if you're working through a set of changes and you hear that your lines might want to go to a certain note, but it might not be pertaining to what the formula says, by all means, if you like the sound of it, play that note. It's just that, you know, you it's just a starting point, and it'll help you, and it'll help guide you along through the changes, okay? So, okay, so the first note is basically going to be a chord tone of whatever chord you're on. So whatever the chord is that you're on, it means that you can play either the 1, 3, 5, or 7 of that chord, okay? So that one's pretty straightforward, okay? For the second note, the way I'll define the second note is you're going to be basically creating some simple diatonic motion from the chord tone that you just played. So what I mean by that is basically coming from that chord tone, either moving it up or down a diatonic second or third, okay? Just creating some simple small motion from the note that you just played, okay? Keyword being diatonic though. So let's say, for example, that the chord was like a major 7 chord, and the first note you played was the root, and then you decided you want to go up a major third. Make sure, or a diatonic third, make sure you're going up to the major third and not the minor. It's got to pertain to what diatonically fits. Okay? Some chords you'll have more options than others because, you know, if you have, it's really all depends on context. If you have, say like a dominant 7 chord, for example, depending on where you started, sometimes the choice is where you can move. You might have some alter notes that you can pick and stuff like that. But, you know, if you know your theory, it should all make sense. Okay, so now before we talk about the third note, I want to say the fourth note first because it's easier to understand, and also because the third note is like the most left open to interpretation and can also potentially be affected by what you're going to play at the fourth note. Okay, so the fourth note we're going to describe as a chromatic passing tone that will be leading into whatever the chord tone is going to be of the next chord. Remember, after the fourth note, the pattern starts over again, so the next note is just going to be a chord tone of the next chord. It's going to be the first position again. So for the fourth note, chromatic passing tone, basically it's going to be a half step above or below whatever that chord tone is going to be. So you really have two options. So that one's pretty straightforward. Okay. Now, for the fourth note, for the third note, like I said, it's the most open-ended. You really have two main approaches of what you could do with it. You could either basically expand upon what you're doing with the second note, or it can be sort of like a pre-expansion of what you're doing with the fourth note, okay? And sometimes, depending on the scenario, whatever note you pick could actually be doing both those things at the same time, which we'll see today in the example that I give. But let me explain. So let's say you decide that you want it to be an expansion of what you did at the second note. That means that just like you created some simple diatonic motion from the first to the second note, you'll be doing the same thing going from the second to the third note. So coming from the second note, again, you can create some simple diatonic motion either up or down a diatonic second or third. And it doesn't matter like if you move, let's say, up a diatonic third from the first to the second note, it doesn't mean that you have to go up another diatonic third. You can choose to move it back down a third, you can move it down a second, you can move it up a second or third. So whatever you want to do, it's just the same sort of concept, simple diatonic motion. Okay. The other approach that you could be doing with the third note, like I said, is it can be sort of a pre-expansion of what you're doing with the fourth note, meaning that like the fourth note is chromatically passing to the next chord tone. So the third note can be a chromatic step before that. So say this is the chord tone that I'm approaching for the next sequence. If this is the fourth note coming from below, the third note can be coming from below that. Okay? Let's say the fourth note is coming from a half step above. The third note could be coming from a half step above that. So basically what you have is, instead of having one chromatic passing tone leading into the chord tone, you'll have two, okay? There is another thing that you could do with this, assuming that you want to take this approach. Say again that this is your chord tone. You can do the neighboring tone concept, meaning, you know, stuff like this. Or, okay, so that's sort of the other approach that you can do, but it's still basically falling under the same umbrella, alright? So that's the basic formula. Now, like I said, you could still use this formula even if you had a chord that lasted a whole measure long. You're basically just expanding upon it. And there's two main ways you can do that. The simpler way would be, like, say you have a chord for one measure, you can basically break it up into two halves and basically do the same thing over and over again, or, you know, the same approach just twice with the chord. So the fourth note, like, of the measure, it'll be a chromatic passing tone that will be leading into a chord tone of the same chord. So you're basically just kind of doing two in one. That's one thing that you could do. Another thing that you could do, though, is you can just basically open up what you have. The main thing to understand is this. The first and the last notes of the formula are the more definitive ones. The first is always going to be a chord tone, and the last one is always going to be a chromatic passing tone into the chord tone of the next chord. So what you have in the middle, it's a little bit more open. You know, again, you can play around just with these simple diatonic motions, like I said, and also, like I said, there's exceptions to all this. Ultimately, once you start doing this, your ear will start to open you up, and you'll hear the possibilities. But you know, again, if you have more notes to work with, you can just be creating more, filling it with just simple diatonic motion. And I know I'm kind of being vague about it right now, but trust me, once you start applying this stuff to examples, it'll start to make sense real quick. Okay, so I want to show you an example, but before I do, let me just also say that the way that I think that you'll get the most out of this concept is this. I suggest that you really use this to begin with in more of a practice scenario, meaning this. Any sort of thing that you're working on with music, especially if you're into improvising, I firmly believe that if you can't execute an idea in a practice scenario, meaning that you took the time to start it and stop it and correct it and make sure it's perfect, if you can't get it right like that, there's no way you can get it right spontaneously in the moment. Okay, so the best thing to do, because you know, it would be nice to actually be able to use this formula like in the moment in an improvisation, but it is a lot to think about. But I'm not discouraging you from it either. But the best thing that you could do would be to basically, you know, take this through as many examples as you can, and when you have all these lines now that you've written, you can basically dissect them and chop them up into fragments. Like, let's say, for example, you know, part of a progression, you might have a 2-5-1, you know, and whatever you played through that 2-5-1 there, now you have a 2-5-1 line that you could add to your musical vocabulary. So stuff like that, you know, the more you use the formula, the more you'll get out of it. It should be obvious. Okay, so the example that I want to give you today will be just one A section of a rhythm changes progression, so 8 measures. The basic progression, for those who don't know, you know, it sounds like this. You know, so we're going to take it through that. Let me just play through it first, just so you can hear what we're going to be working with. And I apologize if I kind of mess this up. I'll go slow to try and get it correct. Okay, and you can see that was a very nice sounding bebop line, and it basically was using the formula that we just talked about. All right, so let's go through it, and you know, I'll try not to be too dense about the analyzation. So first measure, it's basically like a B flat, or maybe like a B flat 7 to a G7. So I played this. All right, so for the B flat, I played, and then it's leading into that. So first note, this is a chord tone of the B flat, it's the 7th. Second note, I had diatonic motion, I moved it down a diatonic second from the 7th to the 6th. Okay, the next 2 notes I did was this. Okay, now it could be seen as that neighboring tone concept, which is leading to the next chord tone, because this is the 7th of the G. But this note can also simultaneously be functioning as diatonic motion, because you know, we went from here to here a second, from the 7th to the 6th, but this can also be thought of as the sharp 5, and if we're talking about dominant chords, that is an acceptable interval. So you can see how that third note again could have both of those functions. All right, so for the G, we play this, and then leading into that. Okay, chord tone, it's the 7th, and I created some simple diatonic motion. I moved down a third. Then for the third note, I decided to move it up a diatonic third again, but it's also functioning as a passing tone, so we're going to be going. Okay, so we're basically leading into this note here. Now we're on the C minor 7, and we're starting on the chord tone. This is the third, okay? So, chord tone, moving it up a diatonic third, basic diatonic motion. Then for the third note of the C minor, I'm moving it up another diatonic third. Okay, for the fourth note, it's going to be a chromatic passing tone leading into the next chord tone. Okay, because this is the third of F7. Okay, and then for F, we have that, which is the chord tone, it's a third. Then we're creating some simple motion, moving it up a third. Then for the third and fourth note, we're going to do the chromatic passing tones, leading into this, which is basically the chord tone of the B flat, I'm sorry, it's the fifth. So far we have this. Okay, so now those changes basically repeat themselves. So for the B flat, we have chord tone, moving it down a third. Now the next two are going to chromatically lead into the next chord tone, because this is the third of the G. Okay, then for the G7, we're going to go chord tone, moving it up a diatonic third. Technically, it's the sharp 5, but it works because it's a dominant chord. Then I'm moving it up another one. Another third. Now, it looks like a third, but actually it's almost like a fourth because they're going up to the root of the chord. And then the fourth note is going to be a chromatic passing tone leading into the C minor. Okay, this is the chord tone of the next for the C minor. Okay, for the C minor, we're going, okay, root note, simple motion, down a second, then chromatic tones leading up to this, which is the third of the F7. Okay, and then for the fourth, for the F, okay, so chord tone. Now here it's interesting, I'm moving it down a diatonic second, but it looks like a minor third because technically this is the flat 9 of F7. So here I'm using an altered tone. Then, sorry. Yeah, was that it? Yeah, so now I'm leading into a chord tone of this F minor, okay? And again, I apologize, I know this is kind of getting maybe a little redundant or complicated, but if you understand theory, hopefully you should be following along with this, okay? For the F minor, now here I'm going to break the rules. I'm actually going to go up a fourth, okay? And then I'm going down a diatonic third. Now, yeah. Then the fourth note is going to be a chromatic passing tone leading into this, which is the third of B flat 7. So for B flat 7, chord tone, up a diatonic third to the sharp 5. Then the third and fourth note are going to be chromatic passing tones leading into this, which is the fifth of E flat major 7 chord. Okay, now here, chord tone, moving it down a diatonic third. Okay, then the third and fourth note are going to be chromatic notes. Okay, leading into this. Now this chord is a E diminished, and we're starting on the diminished 7th here. Now here I'm going to break the rules a little bit. The rest of the line, I'm going to go through it quickly because it kind of diverts from the formula a little bit. But basically, moving it up a third. Now here I'm going to go up a fourth. And now those notes, it's leading into this, but they're not really chromatic. Even this is not like a half step above this, but it just sounds good. Okay? Now for the rest of it, I'm just going to play the line because it kind of doesn't pertain to the formula, but it sounds good, and I'm using my ear to guide me along. I even threw a triplet in there. I'll do it one more time in case you're trying to learn it. Okay, and And that's kind of like a very cliche sort of bebop line that you can put there, almost like a 2/5 type line or a dominant type line. All right, so let me play through the whole thing again real quick. Okay, and again, for the most part, you're just following along this formula. Okay, I've done this through a handful of chord progressions, and it always gives me good stuff. I'll play, I'm not going to analyze it. I hope I remember this. Just one other example, maybe over the changes to one A section of Donna Lee. Sorry. Sorry. Actually, you know what? I don't want to mess it up right now, so let's scratch that. We're over 20 minutes now, so I think I'm going to end it. Again, I think that this is a really good thing that you can use to help you develop lines. I hope that it wasn't too complicated for you to understand. If you have any questions, you can leave stuff in the comments. I hope that you take some value from this, and have a good day.